Hi, I'm Derek Ashong, and you are now in the stream. Today, the economic impact of 9/11. 10 years after September 11, what has the U.S. gained from the so-called war on terror? Our digital producer, Ahmed Shihab Eldin, is here looking out for your live feedback. Also on the couch with us today is Wajahat Ali. He's a playwright, attorney, and blogger. Wajahat, your other job is as a researcher with the Center for American Progress. Tell us about the report that you guys just released.
Sure. This is a groundbreaking report. We spent 6 months on it. It's an investigative report where for the first time ever we expose what we call the Islamophobia network in America. Specifically, we trace 7 funders who have empowered the network to the tune of $42.6 million. These funders give money to a group of very tight, what I call self-reliant, highly organized, effective, incestuous group of individuals, think tanks, grassroots organizations, media megaphones, and political players who are responsible for manufacturing and disseminating much of the anti-Muslim sentiment that we've heard in the past 9 years. For example, the Ground Zero Mosque controversy.
Yes, so you're saying that this is not something that just happened organically, that there's actually been a campaign to promote these ideas.
Exactly. It's not this natural organic groundswell. And in fact, it's not this vast right-wing conspiracy either. What we've realized, it's a group of small, tightly connected, interconnected group of people, which we've categorized for the first time. We've broken it down, named the names, traced the funds to 7 funders, and shown how they've been responsible for manufacturing these talking points. I'll name a couple. You might have heard them. President Obama is a Muslim.
Yeah.
Heard that one?
Yeah.
Mosques are Trojan horses, incubators of radicalization. How about this one? Sharia is a totalitarian threat to America. Sharia, which is Islamic religious law.
Yeah.
And this one, radical Islam has infiltrated America. President Obama's administration, George Bush's administration, and even the Conservative Political Action Conference, only because they happen to invite 2 individuals. One is Sohail Khan, Muslim American Republican, and tax reformer Grover Norquist, who just happens to be married to a Muslim. Right?
This is amazing. Well, the report is called Fear Inc., and we definitely encourage people to check it out. I'm sure we can tweet it out later. Before we go, tell us briefly, I know you're working not only as an intellectual, but also as an artist in addressing some of these issues.
Yes, I'm also a playwright, and the play that I've written is The Domestic Crusaders that was born after 9/11. Actually, I was a 20-year-old UC Berkeley senior when the 2 towers fell. My professor, Ishmael Reed, said, write a play about Muslim Americans because we need your voice out there. Fast forward 10 years later, almost to the month that I started writing the play. We're in New York over the 9/11 weekend. Next couple of days, I'm honored. Play has 3 shows, Domestic Crusaders at John Jay College. I hope people check it out.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
That's a really amazing accomplishment, and we appreciate you taking the time to be with us just before that launch.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. In today's discussion, we're excited to have joining with us a few of our online viewers in our Google Plus Hangout, and we're going to come to them in just a moment. But before we do, we're looking forward to their participation. We're looking forward to yours as well. Remember, you can always tweet us at AJStream with the comments that you want to share with us, and Ahmed has got today's viewer feedback.
So all week we've been asking you to send us your stories about what you experienced on 9/11 and how it may have changed your life. Here's one example sent to us from Sasha Funk, a German citizen who is now living in Thailand. Let's take a look.
It was an incredible sad day. Even though I was far away from America, I did not have television in the first place. I was working in a bank, just starting my apprenticeship. It was a very strange and weird feeling sitting there, listening to the voice telling you that there are too many people dying and a terrorist attack just happened in New York, and seeing my colleagues going on with their work like as if nothing had happened. It's hard to describe, but it somehow changed many of my beliefs and my motivation for doing things. I realized at this day already that I won't stay in the bank forever.
Now thanks to Sasha for that. We don't know his entire story, but he did tell us he is no longer working at a bank in Germany and instead is teaching at a vocational college in Thailand. And for more stories about how 9/11 has changed and is still changing lives, please visit aljazeera.com. You can see right here, this is our website. It's aljazeera.com/9/11decade. There you can find all our coverage, and you can continue submitting your videos and stories to us. And as always, you can tell us here at the stream what stories matter to you. Follow us on Twitter and send your story idea, photo, or video to us in a tweet with the hashtag AJStream.
Hi, my name is Raed Jarrar. I'm an Iraqi-American blogger, and I'm in the stream.
The 9/11 attacks were carried out not only to cause physical destruction, but economic destruction as well. 10 years after 9/11, the United States continues to pay a high price for what was then dubbed the War on Terror. Trillions of borrowed dollars have been spent on 2 foreign wars and costly counterterrorism initiatives that are pushing the U.S. even further towards a debt crisis. So, how much has the U.S. response to 9/11 contributed to its current economic troubles? And what other costs have been incurred? I want to direct you to my screen where you'll see a cartoon that says War Profiteering, it's titled. And at the top it says a rising tide lifts all boats. But if we look closely, these boats are named things like Halliburton, Big Oil, Armaments, Bechtel, various companies that are alleged to have profited from this conflict. And if you scroll down, we see here at the bottom of the ocean the ship of state that is representing jobs, budget deficits, social services, and this little bird in the corner says that the private yachts especially are the boats that are lifted by this war. Here to discuss this issue with us is Linda Bilmes, a senior public policy lecturer at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. In 2008, she co-authored a book with Nobel laureate and economist Joseph Stiglitz. It's called The $3 Trillion War, The True Cost of the Iraq Conflict. Linda, welcome to the stream.
Thank you.
In your book, you estimate that the true cost of the war on terror has been between $3 to $5 million. That was in 2008. Has that number changed at all since then?
Well, it's easy to confuse millions, billions, and trillions.
I'm sorry, billions, pardon me.
Yeah.
$3 to $5 trillion. Let's be clear.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, actually, our estimates have turned out to be very conservative. We at that time estimated that the war would cost at least $3 trillion, and it looks like it's going to cost between $4 to $6 trillion.
Okay, and just explain for us, where does that money go? Where has it been spent?
Well, I think, there is a very significant economic fallout into the war on terror. First of all, the money that we have spent already, which is about $2 trillion on actually war operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and $1 trillion defense buildup, only some of which is directly related to the war. That money has all been borrowed mostly from overseas, which is really an aberration in U.S. history. We've never before had a situation where we have waged a war without raising taxes and paying for the war primarily ourselves. So the only even similar precedent for this was when the U.S. colonies borrowed from France during the Revolutionary War. So the first sort of major economic fallout from our response to 9/11 is the fact that we have amassed well over $2 trillion in debt, which is more than a quarter of the debt that we have amassed during this period. And of course, the country has become very, very concerned about its level of indebtedness. Mm-hmm. But you have to look even further than that to understand the full economic fallout of 9/11 and our response to it, which is you have to essentially connect the dots, because the invasion of Iraq in 2003 set in motion a series of events which put pressure on oil prices, which rose from $25 a barrel in 2003 to $140 a barrel 4 years later. And it was that huge increase in oil prices that put pressure on the U.S. economy, which led the Federal Reserve to inject so much liquidity into the U.S. market, which is one of the main contributors to the housing bubble, which of course led to the bursting of the housing bubble and the financial crisis. So when you look at the whole story, the debt story and the contribution that the wars played to our financial malaise, you see that there's been a very significant consequence to our economy from the way that we responded to the 9/11 attacks.
Now, Professor Bilmes, this is something I would love to get some deeper insight from you on, because we've been putting out some commentary or questions to our audience, and some people were making comments to the effect that, well, war spending historically has sometimes proven to be stimulative. I mean, sometimes people will raise the example of the United States exiting from the Great Depression in part due to spending on World War II. What makes this different?
Well, it's a good question, and people often raise that with me. There are a few differences between this war and the way we paid for it compared with World War II, which was, first of all, a massive mobilization of 15% of the population, which was paid for through a combination of dedicated debt through war bonds and tax rises, as opposed to this war, which was paid for entirely on the credit card. But in addition, when you look at what we spent the money on in this war, a very large percentage of the money was spent on contract assistance in countries. So, for example, we were spending a lot of money on paying foreign contractors to be cooks and truck drivers and so forth in Iraq and Kuwait and Afghanistan. And that has a very low stimulative effect on the US economy. And I would say that finally, you have to think about the spending of trillions of dollars compared to what else we could have spent it on. So what is the counterfactual? I mean, we've spent about $2 trillion on war spending, of whom the only real beneficiaries in the US have been a small number of defense contractors. But that money could have been spent on something like infrastructure spending, which not only would have benefited Americans in terms of jobs, but also would have strengthened the economy because we would have a stronger infrastructure at the present than what we have now.
Okay, so we've got a lot of dialogue coming in from online and from Google+.
Yeah, Linda, you were just talking about contractors. We now understand that the U.S. government is contracting contractors to do the security clearances of other contractors. And I think we have Joe on Google Plus asking a question. Joe, tell us where you're from and go ahead, ask your question to Linda.
Yeah, good evening. Calling from Kuwait. Simply put, was expenditure worth it in terms of not just financial costs, but the human cost, which to me is far more expensive?
So he's a veteran and he's asking, was it worth it? Not just the financial cost, but the human cost.
Well, I think that is a very profound question, and I think that the financial cost will be dwarfed by the human costs of this war, which have been extraordinarily high. And we've not only lost thousands of lives among U.S. and allied service members and among Iraqi and Afghani police and allied armed forces, but we have hundreds of thousands, now more than 700,000 U.S. veterans who have been approved to receive disability compensation for something that happened to them during their service, as well as many hundreds of thousands who are being treated for medical problems of one sort or another through the veterans medical system. And these are costs that will be continuing for decades and decades into the future. So we have both the human toll, the loss of life, the suffering, the quality of life impairment of so many people around the world and their families, but you also have the fact that that carries with it a related long-term financial costs.
Right.
Professor
And we
Bill,
know, yes.
Professor, I want to jump in there because it seems that there's a bit of a disconnect between the kind of cost you're talking about and the response of the American people. Frankly, I want to point you out to another cartoon that we have here. And this has got a gentleman sitting here looking at his screen, and he's wearing a shirt that says "Stay the Course." The TV screen says 4,000 U.S. military deaths in Iraq. He says it's just a number. $5,000 spent on Iraq every second. He replies it's just a number. More than 55,000 Iraqi civilian deaths. It's just a number. Then the TV screen says, in other news, the price of gasoline approaches $4 per gallon. The man is aghast. Is there a disconnect between the way the American people have responded to this conflict and the kind of cost that you are seeing?
Well, you know, I don't really agree with the message in that cartoon. I think that Americans are deeply, deeply troubled by both the financial cost and the human cost of these wars. And I have been, over the past few years that I have been researching this, and particularly working with veterans organizations, what I have seen over and over again are hundreds of people reaching out to me, telephoning me here at Harvard, writing to me and my colleagues asking what can they do to help? What can they do to help veterans? What can they do to stop the war? What can they do? I've seen many people in the medical community reaching out to hospitals and to doctors in Iraq. What I think
But
is
to
the
that same point,
disconnect.
Professor, I think that, when we look at previous conflicts like Vietnam, there was conscript service. When we look at the cost of World War II, you had a significant proportion of the population tangibly affected. Now you have an all-volunteer military, you have a very limited number of people that have to go and fight, and you actually have a lot of people who received tax cuts during the course of this war. They weren't asked to make a sacrifice.
Well, you got exactly to where I was going there, because I was going to say that I think you have an enormous amount of concern and worry about this. But where the disconnect is that most people have not been asked to pay for the war at all, either themselves by fighting or their families, or financially, because it has all been borrowed and put on the credit card. So where the disconnect is that although people are already concerned about it and they don't like it and they're frustrated with the lack of conclusion and what's going on in Washington, they have not personally felt the pain in the way that, for example, they might feel the pain of rising gas prices. Now, in fact, rising gas prices are in fact in part due to the situation in the aftermath of the Iraq War, but people don't really see that connection, and they certainly haven't been asked to pay through taxes or war bonds or personal sacrifice in the way that they were in previous wars.
Linda, on that note, we saw that this top secret world of counterterrorism and homeland security, it seems no one really knows how much the cost is. We hear these big figures, but on Google Plus we have Matthew, who's asking a question to you on that note in terms of the bigger question looming in the future. Matt, tell us where you're from and ask your question.
Yes, I'm a freelance writer and journalist based in Urbana, Illinois. And my question is, because these wars were supported using debt, what does that mean for Generation Y, the millennial generation, and the kind of economic sacrifices that the current and past administration have placed on those generations and also future generations? Does it mean a cut in social services or some kind of economic woe that we'll have to look at in the future?
Well, I think that that's a very good question, because there is not only the trillions of dollars in debt that we have already put on the national credit card to fight these wars, but as I mentioned, there are trillions of dollars to come. There is at least another $900 billion that we have already accrued in future veterans disability compensation, future veterans medical care. We have to pay for replacing all of the equipment and weapons that have been used up at 6 times the peacetime rate, and we have to pay interest on all the money that we have borrowed. Now, all of that imposes a substantial burden on future generations, as well as the burden of reestablishing, strengthening the military, which has been very worn out by repeated long tours of duty. So unfortunately for coming generations, including my children, will be paying for these wars for a very, very long time. And these are unnecessary costs. Due to the way we responded to 9/11, due to the fact that we invaded Iraq in the first place, and due to the very significant decision to pay for both Iraq and Afghanistan and the defense buildup and the homeland security buildup, all on the national credit card. And I want to repeat what I said before, that this is really unprecedented in U.S. history, because the Bush administration cut taxes in 2001 as we went to war in Afghanistan, and again in 2003 with a tax cut targeted very much in favor of the wealthy as we went to war in Iraq. In both cases, thinking that we would have quick, cheap conflicts. Those were major mistakes that will have a significant consequence for the United States economy for decades to come.
I want to get Wajad in here because your report, Fear Inc., basically talks about the funding of Islamophobia in the United States. Is it possible, some have speculated that the desire of people like Osama bin Laden was in fact to shift the relationship between the United States and the Islamic world, both overseas and potentially domestically? Do you think that there's any credence to that?
Well, basically, Al-Qaeda was very forthright about its agenda of what it wanted to do, about its objectives. And one of the objectives of what it wanted to do is it wanted to disrupt America, disrupt American society. have us go all over the place, have a troop here, an army there, fight wars, drain our economy, and so forth, and have us divided amongst one another. Specifically, what I think is really inspiring and encouraging, especially if you look at the new Gallup polls and Pew Research Center polls, is that Muslim Americans, despite being under the microphone, despite the fact that Sharia is now a talking point for 2012 elections, despite the fact that 18% of Americans think President Obama is a Muslim and think he's unloyal to America, despite all of this, we see that in America, the multicultural laboratory of the world, Muslim Americans are still optimistic, still loyal, still patriotic. And what's happening to Muslim Americans right now with this Islamophobia nonsense is simply a repeat. It's a remake. The boogeyman now is Muslim Americans. In the past, it was Irish Catholic, Jewish Americans, gays and lesbians in 2004. The Japanese Americans. So, I mean, that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse to say, oh, everyone has to go through the hazing period. But America is resilient in the sense that it refines its moral compass. And I'm hoping the report, Fear Incorporated, and efforts from our neighbors and partners and allies, they say, you know what? This is not how we do business in America. We don't divide each other along religious lines, and we're not going to play into fear, which is exactly what Al-Qaeda wants.
All right, Professor Vilmus, I want to ask you to hold for just a minute because we're going to come back to you in our post-show. While we do that, we're going to go right now live to Owen Watson. He's Al Jazeera's executive producer for News Gathering, and he's in New York right now to tell us a little bit more about the network's coverage of the 9/11 anniversary. Actually, we're going to take just a second to grab him up on Skype. Before we do that, I think it's fascinating that people are looking at this from multiple angles right now, and I think it's really important. We talk about the human cost, we talk about the military and the political cost, but also this economic toll is really interesting, and I think this question kind of puts some of those together.
Yeah, we have a lot of people talking about the entire concept of profit and the role it plays. True Value Metrics saying one of the biggest, quote, costs in the U.S. economy is profit. Defense contractors are obscenely profitable. Any observations?
I mean, that's exactly the cartoon that we opened up with, and that's one of the reasons why we showed it, is because part of what's happened is you have a very small private sort of volunteer military force in the United States and a lot of private contractors that have profited from this conflict.
And in the Fear Incorporated, what you see is individuals and organizations that have profited off of fear, hysteria, and exploiting that fear and hysteria, exploiting the misinformation, exploiting that ignorance, exploiting that economic and political uncertainty that exists in this volatile climate for the sake of profit and self-gain.
So before we go back to your next point, Ahmed, I want to get Owen right in because he is joining us now. I believe you have him live from Skype. Owen, welcome to the stream. Tell us what the network is going to be covering briefly this weekend.
Well, I mean, the focus for us is not just America. It's actually bifocus. It's America remembering what happened 10 years ago. But where I think where we'll take our programming in a different direction and a slightly different focus is that it's not just about America remembering. It's about the world considering the impact those attacks had 10 years ago. What you will see on Al Jazeera, both online, social, and with television, is that we will be live. To give you an idea of the sort of breadth of our coverage, in Bali, Indonesia, which was obviously touched by Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks, we'll be in Pakistan, Kabul, which was the scene, of course, of the invasion by coalition forces, Baghdad, Nairobi, which witnessed its own, again, Al-Qaeda type attack before 9/11. In addition to that, we sort of shift to Europe with Madrid, London, where the attacks took place there, and we look at the issue of, again, globally, we'll look at the issue of justice in Guantanamo. So I think we want to connect all of the experiences of all those around the world into what occurred here on September 11th.
Thank you, Owen. That sounds really fascinating, and we appreciate you giving us a preview right here in the stream. Best of luck this weekend. And thank you, Wajahat, for being with us, and thank you, Ahmed, for integrating our community on Google+. Thank you for observing this show with us today. Please continue the conversation with us on our line at stream.aljazeera.com. We're going to get back to Professor Vilmus, and we're going to specifically be asking her, let's say the war on terror ends today. What is the ongoing impact in the United States and around the world? You're not going to want to miss this. Be with us at stream.aljazeera.com. Use the hashtag AJStream to communicate with us 24/7. We'll see you online. Hi, welcome back. We're going to continue our conversation with Professor Linda Bilmes of Harvard University on the ongoing war on terror, or at least what was once called the war on terror. Professor Bilmes, I did have a question I wanted to ask you about specifically the impact of this spending, of the economic impact of all of this domestically and overseas. Let's say that the war were to end tomorrow. What would be the legacy?
The legacy will be very, very long-term economic and budgetary costs. There are trillions of dollars that we have yet to spend on replacing military equipment and paying for taking care of veterans. And there are economic costs that we will spend the next decade as it works its way through the system because of the fact that the wars contributed to the series of factors that led us into the financial crisis.
Okay, Ahmed?
Yeah, Linda, we have a lot of comments, questions, but also comments on Google+. So Joe, why don't you go ahead and give us your comment that you chatted in.
Yeah, I wouldn't put this all on the contractors. That seemed to be a lot of commentary.
I think we're having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, we're having some trouble, Joe. We're going to have to wait and come back to you later on. I think we had another question from Sana.
Let's go to Sana. Go ahead, Sana. Sana?
Okay, so my question was basically, how do you escape two wars that have come to signify a paradigm shift in American identity following an event that kickstarted the shift, 9/11?
Linda?
Well, I mean, I think at this point the question is, where do we go from here? And as we think about whether, the current policy is for the United States to keep a substantial number of troops in Afghanistan for the next 3 years. And I think we need to think very seriously about whether we can afford to continue a policy which has brought such a lot of economic cost to the country, and particularly in pursuit of a military victory in a country that has defeated empires for the past 3,000 years.
Linda, if I can, just because I don't want to silence Joe just because he has a bad connection, but we have a chat function, so I'm going to read to you his comment.
Okay.
So he was basically saying that he doesn't want to put it all on the contractors. He says, he's a veteran, of course. He says, the reason they are there is because there aren't the numbers of service members, and that speaks to the conscripted versus volunteer army in the U.S. Now, we saw estimates of the future cost of disability payments reaching as much as $900 billion for veterans. What would you say to his comment?
Well, I think that his comment is absolutely right. I mean, right now we are waging the war in a very expensive way. I mean, and the cost of contractors well, first of all, we're using contractors for virtually every kind of position, for critical military repairs, for engineering, as well as for cooks and chefs and drivers and so forth. So we have waged this war by putting an enormous amount of pressure and strain on a very small number of individuals. And that has extracted a terrible toll, as we can see in the epidemic rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide and depression and divorce and a whole host of other social problems that will long outlast the war itself.
Mm-hmm. Professor Bilmes, I want to thank you for joining us. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Wajad, this is such an intriguing conversation to me because I look at in a way, the way we talk about war, and there's somehow this narrative of heroism, and at least as if in the wake of the death of bin Laden, that Al-Qaeda got their comeuppance or of some sort, but yet and still it seems to be that the American people are paying an exorbitantly high price for that.
And what I find fascinating is, people don't discuss the psychological and emotional cost of the war. There's no dollar sign on that. It's hard to trace.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to ask the doctor, but we're approaching the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and it seems that, our generation, we came of age during that tragedy when the two towers fell. These new kids, who are kindergartners or in first grade, second grade, they've inherited this trauma.
They haven't known another world.
Yeah, they don't know. They've inherited this national security apparatus, this language, this rhetoric of two wars. So what's the emotional cost of those fallen towers?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a question that really I think that post 9/11 generation is really going to have to shoulder.
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see how they bear that burden. And one of the things that's intriguing is how the issue or the actual event of 9/11 has been co-opted by different people. And we're actually going to be able to talk about that now. In the decades since 9/11, many people have mourned losses, but what's been discussed less are the accusations that some people and organizations have actually sought to gain from the tragedy and using it as a profit-generating opportunity. Joining us now via Skype from New Jersey is Becky Garrison. She's a journalist and former 9/11 volunteer who was working at Ground Zero shortly after the attacks happened. Becky, welcome to the stream. Tell us what you've seen with regard to people seeking to profit from 9/11.
Well, one of the first things is from the very get-go, there was a debate over sacred versus commercial space. This was a commercial entity where the attack happened. And there's this push to rebuild that over time took precedence over the proper treatment of human remains. They continue to discover human remains, for example, after the site closed. You had in 2007 a Deutsche Bank fire that ended up killing 2 firefighters. It could have been very easily prevented if people had taken enough care to really make sure that the site was ready before they started rebuilding.
Now, talk to us about who is really in charge of the site. Who has any kind of jurisdiction over what does and does not happen there?
Well, technically, there's an entity called the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation. And as has been reported by the Village Voice, they have been choosing once and forever the commercial needs over the needs of the families. For example, a sizable percentage of 9/11 families have no grave. They estimate about a third of the bodies have yet to be discovered. And the families have asked, well, can we consider Fresh Kills Landfill, which is over in Staten Island, where a number of I'd say a good percentage of the debris ended up there. Can this be made a cemetery? The answer was no. So there's never been also consensus with maybe the families over even the simple placement of their remains at this memorial museum that's going to be opening up shortly.
Mm-hmm. And how have the families responded?
It depends on who the families are. I mean, one of the things you have is that some families have positions with the 9/11 Memorial Museum. They have positions with the LMDC. 3 guesses where their positions are going to lie. There's other family members who've been from the get-go standing outside of Ground Zero trying to make certain claims. I mean, there's a concern about the safety of the Freedom Tower, the safety of the museum. And what I think has also happened is there's media exposure over time is given to a number of select individuals. You know, you had the 9/11 widow that was very articulate and knew how to work the cameras. You had the 9/11 priest who was incredibly charismatic, the preserver of the Ground Zero Cross, all these different people who managed to get the media's attention. The media in search of a soundbite, these were people looking for media attention. It was like moss being driven to fire in a flame.
But isn't that something to be expected? I mean, if you have people who are interesting, have a compelling story, they're charismatic, isn't it natural that they should be highlighted?
There's a difference, I think, between highlighting someone for their good works, because what ended up happening over time, and you see this with a lot of entities, with repeated media exposure, some people could stay on message. You have Father Jim Martin, who did a beautiful book called Searching for God at Ground Zero that really embodied the spirit of what was happening there. I mean, something amazing happened right from 9/11. Everyone came together, different races, ethnicities, I might add with the possible exception of Muslims. But, there was this beautiful, Jewish, Christian energy that got it started. But over time, it became more about, for some people, I want to get my media exposure. So was it about keeping yourself on message, like someone like Father Martin did? Or was it more like, some of the other individuals where it became more about them? The conversation shifted more to what am I getting out of this? What am I producing? Rather than what are the needs of 9/11 communities?
Now, Becky, I didn't fully understand your comment regarding the religion. Are you saying that there was more collaboration between Jews and Christians than with Muslim communities?
No, what I'm saying is that there was been promoted, as you know, throughout once the Twin Towers fell, this beautiful spirit of ecumenical dialogue. Everyone was discussing, look at this, we're all coming together. And it was true. There was amazing. You would have conservatives, liberals, firefighters coming together with, extreme environmental types. And it was just amazing to watch this energy come together. And it wasn't until after the site closed that I realized, well, I didn't recall seeing anybody there who was Muslim. It seemed to be, so despite all this energy that was being generated, look at how we're all coming together, we really didn't come together. We did sort of, but not really.
Yeah.
Now, Wajad, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, because basically what she's saying is that we paid lip service to coming together, but we haven't. And a lot of the research that you're doing seems to reinforce that.
Well, George W. Bush, President Bush at that time, what he did was he did position himself quite strongly, saying that this is not going to be a war against Islam or the Muslims. This is a war against criminal terrorists. But we saw it 10 years later now, we see that Islam has the lowest favorability rating in American history, even worse than after the towers fell. And there seems to be those individuals who we mentioned who have exploited the fear and ignorance and division. 61%.
And why? What do they benefit?
Well, two things happen. Number one, 61% of Americans say they don't know a Muslim, even though we've been here for 300 years. A third of the initial slave trade that came forcibly against their will was Muslims. So we've been here since the founding. But number one, people say they don't know a Muslim. Number two, the research shows that they say what they know about Muslims, which is obviously negative, comes from the media. So in moments of panic, uncertainty, fear, ignorance, throughout U.S. history, we've seen profiteers who deliberately exploit this for two reasons. Number one, profit, and number two, what we expose in the report, some of these individuals, and it's not just conservative or liberal or progressive, it's talking about individuals who have an anti-Muslim agenda, which they promote under the guise of talking about radicalization and national security. But the reality is this, is that Muslim Americans and Muslims worldwide came together. There were 60 Muslims who died when those two towers fell. Salman Hamdani, 9/11 responder, Pakistani-American Muslim, who ran into the towers as they were falling to save people. You saw imams, both locally, nationally, and globally, who prayed for everyone. At UC Berkeley in 2001, when we were there, we did an open prayer service. So we can use this moment to heal, to reconcile, and move forward.
Excellent. That's a wonderful point. Becky, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Absolutely. And I want to thank all of our folks on Google+. You guys had some really great comments. It was great having you here. Wajahat, wonderful having you as well. And Ahmed, great job getting the audience involved. And thank you for being with us as viewers. Remember, we're going to continue these conversations 24/7 online. So hit us up using the hashtag AJStream. We will see you online.